houses and encouraged settlements in all marshy and unwholesome situations. He, of course, was wrong. The poor not only weren't straining the food system, but the world's population skyrocketed throughout the 19th and 20th century, and its resource production kept pace. We managed to prevent collapse. But Malthus had planted a seed, one that reared its head throughout the next 2 centuries. It accompanied Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot as they violently coerced indigenous populations out of their homelands in the name of conservation. It intertwined with the eugenics programs of fascist regimes of the Nazis and Mussolini, and it most prominently surged into the mainstream again in 1968 when biologist Paul Ehrlich published his book, The Population Bomb. In it, Ehrlich echoes many of the same arguments of Malthus, but this time upgraded for a modern world. He drew on the work of a growing movement of neo-Malthusian writers like Fairfield Osborne and William Vogt by arguing that an overpopulation catastrophe was imminent, and he drives home that message by beginning the book with a story of his drive through the streets of Delhi. Steeped in condescension for the poor, much like Malthus, Ehrlich writes that the dirty, packed, and unlivable streets of Delhi are a sign of what's to come in a world with too many people. And Ehrlich's ideas struck a nerve. The book sold over 2 million copies and spurred the environmental movement into action. Ehrlich went on numerous talk shows to explain the importance of population control.
If we want to avoid a tremendous rise in the death rate, we absolutely must have a tremendous decrease in the birth rate.
And many who showed up to the first Earth Day in 1970 were there to raise awareness about overpopulation. But Ehrlich wasn't the only one in the 1970s to revive and popularize ideas of the specter of overpopulation. He was also accompanied by Garrett Hardin.
And the more people you have, the more pollution you have. See, that won't get better.
An American ecologist who married the crisis of overpopulation to racially charged solutions of private property and nationalism. Hardin penned 2 now often cited essays that deal with ecology and population, The Tragedy of the Commons and Lifeboat Ethics. While Tragedy of the Commons argued that private ownership of land is the antidote to environmental degradation and overpopulation, Lifeboat Ethics builds on that argument by asserting that in an overpopulated world, the lifeboat of the rich nations must protect themselves and their resources from the drowning poorer nations trying to clamber aboard. In short, Hardin is arguing that we need to build fortresses around rich nations in order to preserve resources from the over-reproducing masses of the imperial periphery. As we'll see a little later, both Ehrlich's and Hardin's theories about population were wrong. But with Hardin and Ehrlich, we can see the branches of Malthusian thought translated throughout the political spectrum. While Ehrlich, a self-professed environmentalist, saw curbing population as a means of mitigating environmental destruction, Hardin saw population control through the lens of racial purity and property rights. These 2 strains have now solidified in the current population discourse, and now pervade a shocking amount of environmental and political conversations on both the right and the left. The racist traditions of Garrett Hardin and Thomas Malthus are by no means dead. They've just morphed to fit within a new era, one that's seen the rise of a far right drenched in ultranationalism and white supremacy, whose #1 boogeyman is immigration. The relationship between fascists and climate change is a complicated one. And if you really want to dig into those ties, my next video on the rise of fascism in a warming world will do exactly that. And you can watch it early on Nebula right now. But what's crucial to know right now is that when those on the far right talk about building a racially pure nation by way of stopping and violently reversing immigration, they at times tie it to the threat of overpopulation.
The foreign-born population is now growing by 132,000 people every month.
Congress will bring in another million immigrants, and these countries, unfortunately, will be adding another 80 million people.
Because if you look at the rise in Britain's population now, you will see that there is a really serious differential in the fertility of the immigrant population to the fertility of what you might call the indigenous population.
So fractions of the far right have established a twisted response to the resource degradation and climate change they are seeing. One that adds a touch of green to their white nationalist visions, and one that continues the lineage of Hardin's lifeboat ethics and Malthus's thought. as Andreas Malm and the Zekin Collective note in their book White Skin, Black Fuel, the green nationalist ideology explains environmental degradation and ultimately global heating in two ways. The first is by claiming that population rates in the global south are out of control and are causing this ecological crisis. And the second is through the baseless accusations that immigration from the south to the north is causing climate change. So, in the view of some fractions of the far right, overpopulation is intimately tied with threats to national and ecological purity, which is why a prominent member of Germany's far-right party, Björn Höcke, gets a round of applause when he connects Africa's population growth to European border security.
Die Länder Afrikas, sie brauchen die deutsche Grenze. Die Länder Afrikas, sie brauchen die europäische Grenze, zu einer ökologisch nachhaltigen Bevölkerungspolitik zu finden.
Splinters of the German far-right, the Finnish far-right, and the American far-right, among others, are voicing concerns about overpopulation of the racialized outsider, the immigrant. And this public coloring of overpopulation as not just a problem experienced by all, but one specifically caused by non-white countries outside the imperial core hasn't gone unnoticed. These characterizations have consequences. The Christchurch shooter, the El Paso shooter, and most recently the Buffalo shooter, all killed in the name of population control and environmental protection. The Christchurch shooter, who gunned down 51 people in a New Zealand mosque, begins his manifesto with the repetition of, "It's the birth rates, it's the birth rates, it's the birth rates," and then goes on to claim that the invaders are the ones overpopulating the world. Kill the invaders, kill the overpopulation, and by doing so, save the environment. Inspired by this violent tirade, the El Paso shooter's manifesto argued a couple months later that immigration and overpopulation are causing environmental destruction. The manifesto warned of a Hispanic invasion and claims that if we get rid of enough people, our way of life can be more sustainable. And finally, the Buffalo shooter, a self-proclaimed eco-fascist who killed 10 people and wounded 3 others in a predominantly black grocery store, continued this violent racist reasoning in his 2022 manifesto, claiming that immigrants and communities of color caused environmental issues such as air pollution, plastic waste, and climate change. So the specter of overpopulation has tangible and violent ramifications on the far right. It's a myth that gives justification to the white nationalist racist rage boiling under the surface. But population control can also take shape in less immediately violent, but still equally traumatic state-sanctioned efforts. The extreme violence of fascist ideology has a history of bleeding into the policies of those that consider themselves more moderate. Indeed, the long history of panic about population growth is accompanied by a long history of sterilization and fertility control programs pushed by the imperial core onto the imperial periphery. In 1959, for example, the US Senate Committee on Foreign Relations recommended that foreign aid be given to developing countries who establish programs to check population growth. And 7 years later, President Lyndon B. Johnson made that recommendation a rule, setting off a series of US aid programs over the following decade sponsoring population control.
Since 1965, the United States provided rapidly increasing support for population and family planning programs throughout the developing world.
This fervor about population growth led to programs like the 21-month-long emergency period in India, where Prime Minister Indira Gandhi oversaw the mass sterilization of 8.3 million Indians in 1976. Most were predominantly men who were sterilized against their will. But this kind of population control was sadly common in the 1970s. The director of the US Office of Population boasted in 1977 that as many as 100 million women worldwide would be sterilized if various US-sponsored population programs met their goals. So in the latter half of the 20th century, the imperial core, and in particular the United States, used its financial dominance to coerce the imperial periphery to cull their populations. And while nations like the US sought to control populations of non-white nations, they were simultaneously sterilizing oppressed communities within their borders.
About 7,600 people in North Carolina were sterilized, many of them forcefully.
This is eugenics, plain and simple. Under the mythical threat of overpopulation, white nations and the white man at their helms sterilized millions of people of color. Whether or not these leaders of overpopulation believed in the threat or were wielding it as an excuse to build their racially pure nation is inconsequential. The end result is the same. But it wasn't and still isn't just the far right who are hyperbolizing the threat of population growth. Environmentalists on the left have also added fuel to the myth of the population bomb. In 2019, the liberal documentarian who brought us Bowling for Columbine and Fahrenheit 9/11, Michael Moore, executive produced a documentary on climate change called Planet of the Humans. The film claims that renewables will be inadequate to tackle the scope of climate change. So it argues that the only way to avoid this crisis is for environmentalists to face the threat of overpopulation and overindustrialization head on. The documentary latches onto a consistent thread that has appeared throughout the mainly white, male-dominated environmental movement since the 1960s. One that was popularized by Paul Ehrlich and has been perpetuated by the likes of Bill Nye,
The growing population is a problem.
David Attenborough,
I can't think of a single problem that wouldn't be easier to solve if there were less people.
and even Bernie Sanders.
Would you be courageous enough to discuss population growth and make it a key feature of a plan to address climate catastrophe?
Well, Martha, the answer is yes.
All of these environmental figureheads express views about population that are not dissimilar to those on the right and the far right. There are too many humans on this earth, our numbers are destroying the natural world, and we have to decrease our population in order to save ourselves and the environment. Core to this theory is the belief that the rapid increase of people on this planet is causing a rapid increase in emissions. So to combat climate change, to combat food scarcity and environmental degradation, we must address population. Where the left slightly diverges from the right, however, are the solutions to the problem of overpopulation. Instead of outright eugenics, ethnic cleansing, or building borders to keep out the perceived overpopulation of immigrants, environmental advocates worried about overpopulation try to present possibilities of population control scrubbed clean of racial or class-based animosity. Many liberal environmentalists claim that the solution to overpopulation is not coercion or ethnic cleansing. It's education and access to family planning.
What we do between now and 2050 with education, with economic growth, with health and nutrition, that'll really set the course for moderating the population growth between 2050 and 2100.
Bill Gates is at the forefront of this drive to curb population growth in the imperial periphery through education and family planning, a quest that tries to paint population control as a choice. Now, I want to be clear here. Expanding access to family planning is essential, but when approached through the lens of overpopulation, the definition of family planning narrows significantly. It no longer becomes about enabling women and their partners to choose the family they want to have. Instead, it becomes about limiting family size. As Professor of History Matthew Connolly notes in an interview with Al Jazeera,
if you believe this idea that family planning is about helping people to have the families that they choose to have, then you ought also to be assisting those who are not able to have children and would like to.
So what are the implications of an extremely wealthy white man like Bill Gates pushing his form of education and his form of birth control access onto those living in the imperial periphery? It seems as if Bill Gates and those who champion reproductive rights in the name of curbing population growth don't actually want reproductive rights. What they want is for women to have fewer kids. In addition, under the surface lies certain assumptions that tie back to the overpopulation myth's racist roots. It always seems to burden the poor, people of color, women, and those in the imperial periphery with problems that the Bill Gateses of the world are creating by accumulating mass sums of wealth. Indeed, those worried about overpopulation also always seem to be in the seat of power, whether Malthus, Attenborough, or Prince Philip, and the scapegoat of their perceived problem always seems to be those most historically robbed of power, poor women of color in the global south. The key here is that this myth of overpopulation drives a false and dangerous solution, a solution that is paternalistic in nature that tries to save marginalized people from themselves. Regardless of the intentions behind this population control, the reality is that overpopulation is not a problem. Those who panic about population are not only missing the real drivers behind environmental degradation and climate change, but they're also devoting resources and time to solutions that at best are ineffective and at worst are harmful and violent. So let's look at what's actually happening with the global population and what really is the problem. As I said earlier, Earth is now inhabited by 8 billion people. And if the rapid rise of population over the last century scares you, you can take a deep breath and rest easy. The United Nations projects that the rate of population growth is slowing and might eventually decline. Specifically, by 2100, population should plateau at around 10.4 billion people. So the world population will not double itself indefinitely until it suddenly collapses, as some feared during the 20th century. In fact, it seems that we will hit a point where population might start decreasing slowly. This slowing of global population growth is in part due to declining fertility rates and families choosing to have fewer kids across the world. It will not be because there's not enough food or resources. Indeed, we already grow enough food for 10 billion people. But for many, future population isn't really the problem. Overpopulation is supposedly a problem right now. Too many people are using too much land, too much fuel, and eating too much food. Not only does this argument ignore the fact that the imperial core uses far more resources and emits at much higher rates than the periphery, which means that an equal distribution of current resources would solve world hunger and poverty in one blow, but it also abstracts the reality of how and why people consume and create environmental destruction. As we see here, for example, emissions correlate much more tightly to GDP than population. 8 billion people living in a zero-carbon world will certainly create less of an impact than 8 billion people living in a fossil fuel guzzling world. And zooming into a national level, the population density of countries show that fewer people does not necessarily mean less emissions. For example, countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar are all highly emitting countries, yet they are not densely populated at all. This shows that our impact varies greatly depending on the materials that are produced for our consumption. To put it another way, 3 million people using electric trams to get around will create less emissions than 500,000 people using gas-guzzling trucks. But the unfortunate reality of today's world is that companies can make more profit off of pickup trucks than electric trams. So that's what they produce, and that's what's available to us. 8 billion people are stuck in a fossil-fueled capitalist economy. So their only choice is to create emissions and extract resources endlessly. In short, as Martin Epson writes in The Socialist Worker, environmental degradation isn't the result of extra people, but of a system that blindly puts profits before the needs of people or planet. So we need to shift our focus away from population and instead put our energy towards a struggle to completely transform the way in which we produce and ultimately consume. Climate change is fundamentally a problem of fossil fuel production. Production that is driven by a capitalist system that rewards the destructive acts of extraction, ecological destruction, and worker exploitation. To put it simply, fossil-fueled capitalism is to blame for climate change, not an oversized population. So that being the case, there are 3 things that need to happen in order to reverse climate change and alleviate the suffering of billions. The first is to abolish fossil fuels. Clearly, this can't happen overnight. Nor does it mean an end to carbon dioxide emissions without a suitable alternative in its place. As scholar activist Ruth Wilson Gilmore eloquently puts it, abolition is about presence, not absence. So while we dismantle the fossil fuel industry and all that is tied to it through blockades, valve turning, divesting, phone banking, and protesting, we must also simultaneously build up alternatives like hemp-based production, renewable energy grids, food co-ops, and so much more. But stopping and reversing climate change must also involve repairing centuries of the imperial core's violence towards oppressed groups inside and outside of their borders. Which brings us to the second task we must undertake: climate reparations. The imperial core and multinationals who've made a killing the planet and people must be forced or willingly channel financial and intellectual resources towards repairing the wounds they've caused. This must be done without a return on investment or any stipulations. Climate reparations at their core are a massive transfer of wealth that seek to balance out inequalities that some think are caused by overpopulation, but are really the product of centuries of plunder and dispossession perpetrated by the imperial core. But in our current racist capitalist system, Achieving fossil fuel abolition and climate reparations will be an uphill battle, which is why we need to be working towards the third task at the same time we build power for the other two: a socialist revolution. A true reversal of climate change would need to end fossil capitalism as we know it. It's not enough to tax carbon just a little bit. The science is clear. The fossil fuel industry needs to end, and the most long-lasting and most just way to do that is to enable full worker control over our production that steers our factories and material goods onto a zero-carbon path. I'll talk about why we need this socialist alternative in next month's video. It's all about the far right's complicated relationship to fossil fuels and climate change, and you can watch it right now on Nebula. In the meantime, we need mathematicians, scientists, coders, and logical thinkers to help chart that zero carbon path, which is why I've always loved Brilliant. Brilliant is a website and app that uses interactivity to build the next generation of problem solvers. If you're like me, math and science maybe aren't your strong suit, but Brilliant manages to make difficult to understand concepts like quantum mechanics actually fun to learn. Their courses are laid out like a story and broken down into awesome visual pieces and interactive puzzles so that you can tackle them a little bit at a time. Like Brilliant's wonderful course on scientific thinking. Understanding the foundations of the scientific method is crucial to everything from physics to building strong arguments to actually understanding why overpopulation is a myth. And Brilliant has made grasping these crucial concepts intuitive and fun. This little interactive pressure puzzle displays the importance of experimentation and drawing conclusions. By changing the height of the spout, we can begin to understand that gravity is a driving force in water pressure. This type of interactivity is peppered all throughout Brilliant's courses, and there's something for everyone. Whether you want to brush up on the basics of algebra, learn programming, or learn about cutting-edge topics like neural networks. So to get started for free, visit brilliant.org/OCC or click the link in the description, and the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks for making it all the way to this end of the video. I've put a video I think you might enjoy on the screen right now, so feel free to click it and keep on enjoying some OCC videos. Otherwise, I'll see you in a month.
Capturing and making sure we have monetization and line of sight to profitability, but not necessarily trying to get to profits today. We want to make sure we go capture that market.
Bottom line, Venmo's still not breaking even, and it won't be for a while. So part of its appeal is that it's free, which has attracted a ton of millennials, but how do they plan to make money eventually? The company does charge for certain events. If you want to use a credit card instead of a debit card on Venmo, it's a 3% fee. And if you want money in your account faster than the typical 1 to 2 day wait, you can pay for that too. The company also partners with Uber, Chipotle, Grubhub, and others, and makes money off of those partnerships.
The primary way that we make money on Venmo is really by merchants paying us for the acceptance of Venmo, which is the same way that PayPal makes money. Merchants that choose to accept Venmo, they pay us a small fee to accept payment from a Venmo user.
Venmo is not a bank though. PayPal has money transmitter licenses. The money in your account is actually held at a partner bank. It's a common setup for fintech companies that don't have a bank charter. The tech company handles the front end, and it may appear as though the money is sitting in an account on your phone, but it's really not. The partner bank is the one holding that money. It all means that money you keep on Venmo's platform is not insured by the federal government, like it would be in a standard checking or savings account. I mean, no aspirations at all to become a bank?
It's not the business that we're in. We're partnering with major financial institutions that hold that money for us. Wells Fargo is a major partner for us on that, but we work with a number of them.
They're not paying you interest when you keep your money there. They're also not lending it out like a bank can, but they're making a little bit of money. Would you guys ever invest that money?
Separate from Venmo, if you look across PayPal, we will hold balances in some very safe investment grade securities, think government treasuries or things like that.
And so do you earn interest on that, I assume?
A small amount, yes.
Got it. But that small amount can really add up for a company holding a boatload of cash, offering a big money-making opportunity for Venmo. So how does Venmo actually work? You link your bank account, type in someone's number, the dollar amount, and send it, but it's not all that easy.
Think of it as a duck going across water. It looks very smooth to the consumer, but below is their feet moving very quickly. You send money to me, Kate, it shows up in my Venmo account real time, but the money is really not in my bank account. Could I go spend it? No. Could I go to the ATM and use it? No. So how Venmo works, if I wanted to get it and move it into my bank account, then I have to go into the traditional bank system we call ACH, or the automated clearinghouse. And that's when all the friction happens. Just like our roads and bridges are broken, our payment infrastructure is old and broken. All the transactions are batched up, sent to the Federal Reserve, and it's sent overnight to your bank. And so it's very inefficient, and it really shows up the next day between the banks.
Venmo is hardly the only game in town for digital payments. Square's popular peer-to-peer cash app has similar features, and according to one report, is growing even faster than Venmo.
The Square Cash App downloads have actually exceeded Venmo's. Every month that passes by, the gap between the two keeps widening. So literally Square Cash adds about 2 million users every month, which is amazing. If you go on Google Trends and type Square Cash, what you'll see, which I thought was striking, is along the southeast, that's where most people have searched for Square Cash. You don't see that as much in the Northeast and sort of the Pacific West. And the interesting thing there is it turns out that there's a socioeconomic thing to this. The Square Cash app, it's become sort of the go-to app for the underbanked. Whereas Venmo is still being used a lot, but is a different socioeconomic group of people, let's say, like, I don't know, the cliche is like millennials.
Got it. So sort of the coastal millennials are using Venmo.
Pampered millennials versus hardworking, underbanked. So I mean, I'm exaggerating, but that's sort of like the way it turned out.
But Bill Reddy insists Venmo is also going after the underbanked.
This aspect of finding ways to get the underserved, whether that's on the consumer side or merchant side, into the digital economy, extremely important, not just for us, but I think to the health of the economy.
Banks are also getting into that P2P payment game. The big banks, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citi, Wells Fargo, and others, launched Zelle in 2017, and Zelle is a little bit different than Venmo. There's no middleman, so it's directly integrated with the banks.
There's more security around it because there's more compliance, because the regulators look at that and look at those transactions and ensure that you're doing it in a proper way.
According to a Wall Street Journal report, Venmo was hit by a wave of payment frauds in 2018 that helped push losses higher than the company previously expected. They recorded an operating loss of about $40 million, nearly 40% higher than the loss for which the company had budgeted. In a statement to CNBC, PayPal said, Venmo loss levels are lower than the overall average for PayPal and compare favorably to the industry. When introducing new features, it is not unusual to see short periods of elevated losses. Reddy said preventing fraud is one reason they collect data, which has gotten other tech companies like Facebook into hot water.
To be very clear, we're not in the business of selling people's data. We don't engage in that. We leverage things about the device and those types of things for fraud protection purposes. In terms of the user's information being shared, the user is in full control of what they share.
Financial technology, or fintech, has a higher bar for regulation. Venmo has run into issues with the FTC, but it's settled. The industry watchdog accused Venmo of misleading customers when it came to privacy disclosures and some information being automatically displayed on Venmo's social newsfeed. The FTC also alleged that Venmo misrepresented the extent to which consumers' financial accounts were protected by, quote, bank-grade security systems.
We have been a pioneer in the space. When you're doing things that have never been done before, you're trying to make sure you do the best that you can to work with regulation that exists, but sometimes that regulation may not speak to new things that have not been done before. And the FTC settlement, much of it was addressing things that we had already addressed, but we have absolutely made sure to implement all the recommendations. We always work very closely with regulators. We really take an approach that we have a common interest with regulators.
Venmo has had to comply with international sanctions and law enforcement, which can be tricky when people are communicating with emojis. So how do you distinguish what's a joke and what's really a threat?
So we actually, from regulators, get a list of keywords. And if people use those keywords or names that might be on a terrorist watch list, any of those kinds of things, we are obligated to go intervene and report those. Now what we're able to do in those is give the user a way to go explain what it was that, like, okay, you weren't buying goods from Cuba, you were buying a Cuban sandwich.
Are there certain emojis that would trigger a warning from Venmo?
We don't have a list of embargoed emojis just yet, but maybe that's coming in the future.
Got it. So Venmo has revolutionized the way we think about cash. But Wall Street is still watching to see whether or not it can really become profitable for its parent company, PayPal. Like any fintech company, there are plenty of challenges. The bar for regulation is very high. There are data and privacy concerns, and of course, they've got tons and tons of competition.
and finishing shop in Queens, New York, and where, much like manufacturing shops nationwide, finding skilled workers like these is a growing challenge.
We have more jobs than we have people for, about 1.5 jobs for every 1 worker.
Jay Timmons, who leads the National Association of Manufacturers, describes all this as a profound problem for the companies he represents.
99.9% of them will say that their #1 challenge right now is being able to fill those open jobs.
So you are here as a representative of more than 14,000 manufacturers in these United States. And the #1 problem for 99 out of 100 of them is filling jobs.
Yeah. I never thought I'd be able to say that. But now it's kind of an all hands on deck. We've got to fill these jobs that are open.
And there are nearly 800,000 of those jobs open right now, according to the latest federal count, a number that surged in recent years as companies reinvest in American-made products, or try to anyway. And with manufacturing workers earning more than $30 an hour on average, Timmons says the problem is not pay, but perception.
It used to be dirty, dark, and dangerous. Today it's very sleek, it's very technology-driven.
And that's what we saw when we visited Electrosoft, a company outside Philadelphia that makes circuit boards for everything from missiles to submarines.
So over there is the quality area where we do first piece article testing, final testing.
But CEO Carla Trotman says they could be doing more if only she had the workers to do it.
How many people work here right now?
30.
How many people do you wish worked here right now?
45.
So you got 15 people that you have jobs for,
yes,
but you can't find them.
Cannot.
How much money in lost business is there in not being able to hire the people that you want?
Around $5 million in top line revenue.
$5 million?
Yeah.
That would be here, and that presumably you'd be paying taxes on.
Obviously,
and that would go into people's pockets and would be going out into the broader economy.
Yeah.
What is your theory about where those 15 people are right now?
I honestly have no idea where they are.
She suspects some people may be sitting out because of a recent change in the way many of us look at work.
I think it's fulfillment. I think it's culture. I think people really want to feel as though they are appreciated. I mean, Beyonce's song, she said, release your job. A lot of people release their jobs. They don't, and they realize, I mean, it's an overall feeling of being fed up and being taken for granted.
But there's more, according to one economist. Some non-working men face a skills mismatch. A third have criminal records, making them ineligible for many jobs and making employers hesitant to hire them. And many rely on safety nets, such as disability. So you may wonder, what are these guys doing instead of work? Well, kind of what you might expect. Spending nearly 7 hours each weekday on average, relaxing, playing games, and watching TV.
So how is it, from where you're sitting, from your understanding, that people can do nothing all day and still have enough money for a bag of chips?
Oh, well, it's almost as though some entity is paying them. It's almost as if somebody is not letting them fail. It's as if some giant parent somewhere has...
An uncle, maybe?
Could be a rich uncle, yes. Could be a very wealthy uncle.
Or it might come down to values. As many public schools have stopped offering shop class, many students have stopped even considering jobs like the ones Roe has spotlighted, dirty or otherwise.
It goes back to the stigmas and stereotypes and myths and misperceptions that are keeping guidance counselors from talking about opportunities like this to the kids in their care. It's those things that are keeping parents from putting all the options on the table.
How big of an issue is it to have this many people sitting on the sideline?
It's only a matter of our national identity. I think it's a giant issue, and by the time we realize how big an issue it is, we're going to have a hard time turning the temperature down.
It's a fascinating story.
7 million men, and they're watching 7 additional hours
I was
of
going to
TV
say that.
and relaxing.
Yeah,
per
that
day.
figure got me.
It's wild.
Are the women in their lives, or the partners in their lives working?
So this is where it gets a little bit political. People on the right will say these guys are just living off government largesse. They're getting disability, they're benefiting from aid, and that's got to be reformed. And people on the left say they just need to be trained up. And yeah, in the meantime, they're living at home or they're depending on partners.
You mentioned this skills mismatch, and it just made me think, my grandfather was a machinist, which is a highly skilled job. Not anybody, you have to be trained to do that. And I don't know a lot of machinists now in 2023. And I wonder if people are being trained for that. And he mentions Mike.
So Mike Rowe has a foundation called Mike Rowe Works, where he does give people scholarships for that kind of training. That's part of the issue. But like Carla Trotman, the woman in Philadelphia who runs the circuit board manufacturing facility, she'll train you herself. If you're in the Philadelphia area, they're looking for 15 people there. It pays well. It's a nice, clean, quiet place to work. So go there. By the way, some people think, oh, maybe these guys are doing more stay-at-home dadding. That's an optimistic point of view. I looked at the numbers. Shauna Thomas, our executive producer, brought this up. In fact, these guys who are not working and not looking for work are spending less time caring for other household members than the guys who are at work. So they're doing less childcare, not even a little bit more.
I don't know, but an able-bodied man who can work and doesn't, it's not attractive. I'm just going to say, not attractive.
And on that note,
Okay. I'm just saying for a friend.